Alright guys, I'm back with Beer School for today. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. It's taken me a little bit of time to figure out what platform is going to be best suited for what we do for Beer School. And I think I found out. I think I found a home here on YouTube. I think it's going to allow us to do what we want to do particularly well. Last week I was sitting down and I was very uncomfortable doing that. I usually stand up whenever I do Beer School. I'm mingling with you guys and talking with you as I'm pouring the beer. And I think that works best. So I'm going to try it again this way, and it's a little bit more natural to what I do. If customers do come in, please forgive me. I'm going to try to edit the video the best I can as we go along. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get to the nuts and bolts of today's Beer School. It's going to be Belgian Golden Strong Ale. Springtime is here, and so whenever that happens, we start to see prettier days. We start to see some blooms on some trees. Things start turning into a little bit more of a floral, a little bit more of a whimsy mindset. And so the beers kind of go there too. Whenever I think about springtime, when I think about the grass growing, all the new smells and all the things that are coming out, my mind really goes to the Belgian beers. And not just any kind of Belgian beers, it's the Belgian lighter colored beers, which are usually the pale ales, the golden ales, and the stronger golden ales. One of the reasons why we chose the stronger golden ales today is because the stronger ones are still really well suited for some of those cooler nights and some of those brisk kind of days. It's fairly windy, has a little chill in the air, even though it's a very pleasant day. So the beers today, I think, are very reflective of that. When you think about the stronger golden ales, the reason why they differ from the regular pale ales is that they are a little bit higher in alcohol content. You do taste the alcohol a touch. There's a lot of other things going on with the beer to highlight some spices, to really throw the balance into a little bit more of a neutral category that most people kind of like real well. To really describe to you what Belgian Strong Golden Ale is, it's a beer that really does celebrate the Pilsner malt characteristic particularly well. The reason why it does that is because at one time, the beers of Belgium were, from a grain standpoint, no different than a lot of other European beers until the Pilsner malt was invented during the Industrial Revolution. It's kind of sweeping through Europe and Belgium, in the mid-1700s, late 1700s. Prior to that, you had to kiln the grains over an open fire. It usually lent some smoky, some darker properties, some toastier properties to the beer. But once the hot plates were developed by the Industrial Revolution, that's whenever you could actually kiln the grains in a very light way, so it didn't impart smoke. It did not impart peppery flavors. It did not impart toasted characteristics to the beer at all. What you end up with was a very light bready kind of characteristic, and so that bready characteristic was highlighted by the Pilsner beer that kind of was established in the Czech Republic and kind of spread through the Germans. The Germans kind of perfected that style, and so it wasn't very long after that grain was developed. A lot of other beer styles really started going away. The darker, the richer beers, the Pilsner was king. So what happened then is the Belgians felt like, okay, this is compromising who we are, but we need to embrace this grain at the same time. So they decided to take that grain, brew with it, and but keeping their fruity and their spicy characteristics just the way that we want. We'll get into those fruity and spicy characteristics in just a moment. The brewery that decided to do that was largely famed by the Deauville Brewery. They're a brewery that after more secular breweries were allowed to develop, sell beer, make beer, and sell to the populace, not just the Trappists, not just the monks. This is one of the breweries that came out of that fold, and once they decided to embrace that Pilsner malt and become very popular, they made what's called the Deauville. It's the Mortgap brewery, so they made the Deauville beer. One of the things I like about this beer is whenever you pour it, it looks bright, it looks clear for the most part. There's a very mild haze from the yeast that develops, but it really has that sparkling golden characteristic that you think is synonymous with the Pilsner, that you think is synonymous with some of the lagers that kind of dot the landscape of American beer. But the highlight of some of these beers, outside of the ones that Deauville makes, we have some really nice variety of beers we're going to talk to you today. And they all kind of share some similarities. Even though the grain profile is a little bit on the lighter side, they have a little bit of a hopping that uses those Germanic noble hops, things like the Tettnang, the Saaz, the Hallertau. Some of those hops that originate in the Polish regions, the Belgian regions, and also the German regions. Those hops have a really delicate floral characteristic that blends into the spices particularly well and fruits particularly well. They have, on the finish, they have a little bit more of this peppery characteristic that I think is oftentimes will taste like mint or parsley or lemongrass or lemon pepper. So that's kind of the hop profile that comes from all those hop varieties, and so that shows up in these beers too. Because the grain profile is so light, they usually do hop these beers a little bit more than you will with like the Deuvils and the Belgian quads. The water profiles on these can vary quite a bit. The reason why that happens is because each brewer traditionally was a little bit a slave to their water profile, whether they were near a stream or a lake or some sort of river, and whatever mineral characteristic that water had is what gave them the kind of profile they had. So if it's a very mineral-rich water, the beer has a good snappy, clean, kind of zestiness to it. If the water is a little bit on the softer side, the beer had this elegant kind of softness. It kind of rounded the malts particularly well, and it highlighted the fruits a touch more. So a lot of the water profiles can change quite a bit as well. But the star of the show is the yeast. The yeast of these beers are what the Belgians really prize and give them the most of the unique flavors that they demonstrate. You get a lot of really unique fruit flavors and a lot of unique spice flavors from the yeast. When you taste these beers, you're going to think, oh my gosh, they've added some sort of fruit, or they've added some sort of flour, or they've added some sort of spice. None of that's true. All these beers, all that natural flavor comes directly from the yeast. Reason why, those are byproducts that the yeast is going to produce during fermentation, particularly during the reproduction phase of fermentation. Whenever you brew the beer, basically what you're doing is you're adding the grains and water together, and you're going to crush the grains, you're going to add the water, and that's the mashing process. Once that mashing process goes through its stages, you're going to eventually take it through some really low range cooking opportunities, and usually you're not even going to approach boiling with those grains. But at some point around 168 degrees, you're going to say, okay, that cooking process is done. You're going to strain off the liquid stuff and leave the solid stuff behind. The husk and all that stuff kind of stays behind. You make bread out of it, you can make dog biscuits, whatever you want. But it's the liquid stuff that brewers want, because that stuff's going to go to the brew kettle. That's when you do go to boiling. You bring it up to a very big rolling boil, and then you add your hops. Your hops at that point is going to give you a little bit of a balance in bitterness, but it's not going to give you a whole lot of hop aroma or flavor. That boiling process is usually going to go about an hour, and after that's done, then you're going to start to cool down that what's considered wort or unfermented beer at that point very rapidly. Whenever that's done and you bring the temperature down to the point where you put your finger in there, you no longer say ouch. That means you're at the right temperature for yeast pitching. At that point, you're going to add the yeast to the beer, and it's going to start the fermentation very quickly. The Belgian yeast are very tenacious yeast. They get to work extremely fast. They want to control the colony. So if there's any other things like mold spores or bacteria in there, the very tenacious yeast won't let them get a foothold in the fermentation process. So you get a very clean fermentation with just the Belgian yeast. During that process, the yeast is going to start eating all those available sugars from the grain, and it's basically going to create alcohol and carbon dioxide. So if you think about it this way, the alcohol is basically the yeast poop, and the carbon dioxide is basically the yeast farts. So enjoy your yeast poop and your yeast farts. But that's not all. If you're an American brewer, then all those flavors of the alcohol are basically what you're going to get. You're going to get very clean ethanol flavor. You're not going to get a whole lot of byproducts. When it comes to Belgian yeast, they're not wild yeast, but they're certainly on the fringes of brewer's yeast. So what that means is it's going to give you a whole lot of those other byproducts. And so those byproducts are going to result in fruit flavors and spicy flavors. The fruit flavors we call esters, and the spice flavors we call phenols. And so whenever a brewer decides, okay, we want to ferment this beer at this certain temperature, in this shape of a vessel, in this volume of a vessel, and all the conditions are right, we give the yeast the proper nutrition through the water profiles, we treat our yeast so well, hopefully at the end of the game, whenever the beer is finished fermenting and all the alcohol is created, you don't have a whole lot of residual sweetness left. We're hoping that you get equal part fruit and equal part spice. That's what gives you that balance that brewers prize so much in the Belgian world. One of the other beers we like really well is the Deauville Brewery beer. This is a very elegant beer by a very good brewery. This brewery sells particularly well at our place. We do prize Belgian beers here a little bit more than your average brew pub will, than your average shop will. At the Beer Trap, we've worked really hard to try to create this synergy for Belgian beer, even though we handle a lot of other beer styles particularly well also. But the Ara beer is by Deauville Brewery, and we actually love this brewery quite a bit. They don't make a poor product. They're very good. One thing I like about this beer is the fruit flavor is going to come through in a very prominent way. When we talk about the fruit flavors or those esters that result from these beers, we're talking about flavors that resemble pear, apple, lemon. Maybe sometimes a tropical fruit presence of pineapple can show up a little bit in some of these beers, particularly as it warms and it starts to outgas a little bit. So we really like that kind of flavor, that fruitiness in the beer. And like I said, they're not adding any fruit to the beer. Those are all naturally occurring products that the yeast create that stays in the beer. At some point, the yeast is going to fall dormant at the end of fermentation, and it's going to start to absorb a lot of other unpleasant aromas and unpleasant flavors, and it settles out. As that happens, we call those glycogen stores, because when the yeast falls out, it doesn't know if it's going to be dormant for a little bit of time, a couple of minutes, or a very long time, a couple hundred years. We know that yeast can survive a couple of hundred years because we've revived shipwrecks and try to rebrew with the yeast that's sitting on the bottom of those bottles. Even though that beer tastes terrible at that point, the yeast is still alive. You think it's dead, but it's not. It's just sleeping. So what happens whenever the yeast decides, okay, we need to fall dormant. We've eaten a lot of the sugars. There's not a whole lot of nutrition left. We've created some acidity. We've depleted all the vitamins and minerals from the water profile. So now we're like, okay, we're in a dangerous state. So the yeast knows to do its best lemming impression by basically reabsorbing some of those flavors and sulfurs and aldehydes and things like that creates during the fermentation process. It reabsorbs those to strengthen that cell wall, and it falls dormant. At that point, the brewer's going to turn on the valve and it'll let all that stuff that falls on the bottom escape. And so that basically takes all of the yeast with it and some other polyphenols or pieces and parts of the plant materials from the hops and from the grains that settle to the bottom. They precipitate out. So when you turn on that valve, all that stuff kind of leaches out and you end up with clear beer above that. So that's what the brewers want. The real trick about Belgian beer, and particularly the Ore beer, it leaves so much of those esters and phenols behind that that yeast can't possibly reabsorb all that characteristic that it created. So that's the stuff that stays in the beer. And if that stuff stays in the beer at a threshold that's above human taste, our palate's taste, then that means, okay, we can taste it and we recognize that flavor. Ooh, that's a fruity flavor, or that's a spicy flavor. So they do a really nice job with the fruits there. Delirium Tremens is a really nice beer as well that we're showcasing today. This is probably the most popular Belgian Strong Golden Ale that we sell, basically because it's a white bottle and it's got a pink elephant. So everybody kind of digs that. It's very eye-catching. It really does draw your attention very, very quickly. What this brewery wants to do is they want to get you with the gimmick of the bottle. We're going to paint it white. We're going to put some speckles on it, make it look like it's clay. And then we're going to put a pink elephant on it. But they hope you come back for a second time because of its taste, and they do a really good job on it. So the spice flavors you get from a lot of these beers are going to remind you of sort of the lighter spice profiles, like the cumin, the coriander, the white pepper. Vanilla sometimes can show up. Some bubblegum characteristics can show up. And yes, we do consider those spices in the beer world. And at some point you're going to say, well, this is a light colored beer, so are the fruits always light in their flavor profile? Yes, they always are. And the beer is always kind of light in color, so is the spice flavor going to be the light spices? Yes, they are. It just so happens it shows up in the flavors that resemble the colors, and I don't think there's any real science to back that up, but it's just an observation that you make as you drink a lot of these Belgian beers that are lighter in color. The fruit flavors are a light fruit profile, and the spices are a light spice profile. If you switch gears and go to a Belgian double or a Belgian strong dark ale, then you're going to notice that the flavor profiles of spices get darker, and the flavor profile of the fruits, they just get darker. So that's kind of how they're handled in the beer world. So Delirium Tremens is something that's a really good seller and a really good mover for us. People really do dig that. One of the other cool things that the Belgian yeast produces, it doesn't just give you that clean ethanol like an IPA will in the American world or a brown ale will in the English world. What happens is these Belgian yeast also produces a little bit more acidity than we usually give credit for brewer's yeast doing. All beer creates some acidity, but we're kind of used to acidity being things like Goses and Berliner Weiss with a high level of acidity. Most brewers' yeast, especially the Belgian yeast, they don't create that much acidity. All beer creates some sort of acidity, and that helps to make the beer a little thinner, a little bit more palatable, a little bit more drinkable. Le Chouffe does a really nice job with that kind of acidic nature. So whenever you taste these beers, not only do you get the fruit characteristic, the spice characteristic, but the alcohol is not inert. It tastes acidic as well. So when you think of those acidic things, you're going to think of, oh, does that taste like white wine? Yes, it does. So if you read things like Chardonnay or a Zinfandel or something like that in some of these beers, don't be afraid to kind of let that play on the tongue. They do have a very winey characteristic. Think of it this way. Belgium and France, they share a border. Yeast don't carry passports, and so at one time before Louis Pasteur came along, we were not able to really identify how yeast worked particularly well. We knew it was there, but we didn't know how it worked. So we were basically at the whim of whatever is floating in the air would settle in the brew kettle or the fermentation vessel after fermentation was complete, and you just live with the results. So this valley may produce this level of fruitiness, spiciness, and acidity, and another valley might do it slightly different. That's just the terroir of those regions. So since yeast don't carry passports, they were able to mingle from France to Belgium and from Belgium to France. So that's one of the reasons why the dormant yeast in those areas, or the indigenous yeast in those areas, could actually take on those wine-like characteristics. So beer sometimes can taste like wine, or what I like to say is those wines can sometimes taste like Belgian beer. Pirate Ale is also by Steenberg. This is the strongest one we're going to have of the day. The alcohol content you usually get out of these beers will dance somewhere between 7.5% and 12% alcohol. This is the strongest one. This one's above 11% alcohol. When you get an alcohol content that's actually strong, 11, 12, 13% alcohol, keep in mind that the yeast that's responsible for that alcohol content is a living, breathing organism. Whenever it feels stresses and it feels the pressure of everything going on too. So even though you put a lot of malt into that beer, a malt where you think the yeast can consume all that malt and create a lot of alcohol, at some point it's going to say, okay, I've already created this highly acidic environment, it's got a lot of alcohol, there's a lot of stressors coming at me, and I need to fall dormant. So the yeast sometimes can fall dormant without completing all of its work. Most of the Belgian beers that we're tasting today is going to have an attenuation rate that's 80 or 90%. That means that the yeast is going to do a really nice job of eating 80 or 90% of the sugars and only leave about 10% of the acids behind. When that happens, you end up tasting more of the sweetness. It may attenuate only 70% of the sugars and leave 30% behind. So you taste that extra 30, and that's what happens with Pirate Ale. It's a little bit more of a sweeter Belgian Strong Golden Ale. So they balance that with a little extra hop usage. So this beer is going to be a little bit more bitter. You're going to taste a little bit more of that floral, a little bit more of that spicy, a little bit more of that grassy characteristic from the hops. But that fruit flavor is amplified, that spicy flavor is amplified because it is a stronger beer. The yeast has just had to work harder. As it works harder, it produces more fruit, more spice, and so it stays to the beer for your pleasure and enjoyment. This beer is getting a sweetness that might hinge a little bit more toward a barley wine, but not too much. There's still a great sense of drinkability when it comes to these beers. One thing that's really neat about Belgian beers is whenever it creates carbon dioxide, it creates a lot of it. So these beers have a very definitive bounce on the palate. Whenever you taste these beers, you put them in your mouth, you pour them, first thing you're going to notice, it erupts this very, very voluminous type of head. When that happens, you got to fight through that foam to get to the beer, but that's good because that foam is going to create a lot of aroma, a lot of spice, a lot of fruit, a lot of floral characteristics. You're going to smell the acidity, so you're going to know a lot about the beer before it even touches your lips. But then as you take the beer into the mouth, it's going to pop on those nucleation sites on your tongue. Nucleation sites are basically the rough parts of your tongue that you don't even know are there. When the liquid does that, all the carbonation that's dissolved inside that liquid is going to come out of suspension very rapidly. What that does is it creates this air bubble and pushes the liquid off of the surface of the tongue, and it makes you swallow the beer much faster than you think you will. The Belgians like that characteristic because that means the beer can be very, very strong, but not have a heavy effect on the stomach. It's not a very heavy beer, it's not a very bready beer, it's not like you just ate a loaf of bread. It has this airiness to it, it has this lightness to it, even though it's high alcohol, even though it has a body to it, and it has some very complex flavors and a lot of varying flavors. They like that characteristic of the carbonation because, number one, it makes the beer look good. Number two, it makes the beer smell good. And number three, it really highlights those spice characteristics and balances out that fruit property and brings the beer in perfect balance from the flavor perspective. And then in the mouthfeel, it gives it that balance. It gives it airiness, that brightness, and that lightness on the stomach and on the palate, so you don't feel like it's such a chore to drink the beer. So that's what Pirate Ale does particularly well also. That's the 5 beers we're celebrating for today's beer school. Now, if you're curious about some other tidbits, we usually put these beers in a tulip to really highlight that appearance, to really concentrate aromas, and to make it so that the beer has a delivery place on the tongue that's perfect, kind of in the middle of the palate. One of the really cool things about these beers are the beer and food components. One of the things I love, the cheeses I love with these beers are the very strong brie cheeses, or the Abbey, the wash rind cheeses that you get in some of these caves and cellars. I like those. They're kind of the mushier cheeses. They're softer cheeses. They're usually on the white or creamy kind of side. They're the ones that smell like feet and you just can't wait to eat them. That's kind of how these play out. So those cheeses go real well with these kind of beers. When it comes to the entrees, go with something, you can go with like a seafood, but go with a firm seafood. Spice it up pretty liberally because these beers can handle the spice. They can handle the firmness of some of the seafoods. I like crab cakes, but you can go with some curry dishes, some other ethnic dishes as well. Some green curries from Thai or from India work out real well with these also. When it comes to desserts, you got to think about the delicacy of the grain profile on this, and think about something like an amaretto tart or a flan or something like that. So that's the 5 beers that we're celebrating for today's beer school. I know I went quick through that. I'm going to try and keep these videos as short as I can. And so we'll see what we do next week. Thank you very much.